This edition of Up to Speed is brought to you by Centerline Liberties. Centerline Liberties is a 501c3 focused on advancing policy solutions capable of defending core constitutional freedoms and liberties, preserving a free market economy, and limiting the role of government in Americans' everyday lives. Find them at centerlineliberties.org. Welcome to another edition of Up to Speed, brought to you by New Hampshire Journal. I am Michael Graham, managing editor of NHJournal.com. We have talked about it so many times here on Up to Speed, which our goal, as you know, is to take busy people like you who are politically or civically engaged and bring you up to speed on some corner of what's happening in the economy. And housing has been happening over and over again. We've talked about it so many times. Where will people live? How will we find workforce housing? How will we have a job force housing? But you know, there's something that you put in those houses. It's called a family. And if there's not a way for families to afford to live in the Granite State, we're going to continue to be where we are now, which is below the national average for population growth. So what do we do? Well, there's a new study on the state of childcare in New Hampshire, the willingness of citizens to help their neighbors with childcare. And we're going to bring that data to you here on Up to Speed. Rebecca Woitkowski is the Child and Family Policy Director for New Future. She's going to help us. And pollster Alex Lundry with Redbud Consulting is going to as well. Welcome to Up to Speed.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with Rebecca, because nothing personal, Alex, she's a lot more attractive than you are. No, I'm kidding. But no, let's start with Rebecca, which is, what is the state of families in New Hampshire who either have young children or hope to have young children, and their view of where childcare is? Is it just something you buy? Is it a concern? Or are we in full out panic mode?
The reality is that New Hampshire families don't have a lot of choice when it comes to what is available for the care of their children. And therefore, a lot of families are choosing not to have children or to have fewer children. And that really is based on the economic costs and availability of childcare that meets a family's values and needs with regard to their own family dynamic. So we are reaching a point of crisis. We have known that access to childcare was a problem in New Hampshire for over 20 years. But now, with the compounded nature of challenges with housing and other slower economic growth, is really coming to a point where New Hampshire has to make a decision about how much they really value the family.
So I'm going to get to Alex's poll data in just a second, but back on your data, what's the current situation? What numbers, what data can you give us about childcare, its availability, its affordability, et cetera, here in New Hampshire?
Sure. So really simply, for infant care, you're looking at over $21,000 a year for center-based care. Wow. For toddler care, that's
I gotta be honest. I just throw the kid back. I'm kidding. That's crazy.
Well, hopefully not. We want to encourage.
I don't know. I have four. So I could.
Okay. So I have two, but about $17,000 for toddler care. And then even more striking is for preschool care. It's about $12,000.
Wow.
So, and the reality is that all families want to have safe and, stable childcare, that they don't have to worry about whether or not their child is in good hands. So, it's expensive to have safe and nurturing care for kids. And for a lot of families, it's out of reach. So, we are creating a system that just doesn't encourage family growth in New Hampshire.
So, Alex, when you ask people, as your poll did, how they feel about childcare, its availability in New Hampshire, and what we should do about it, what were the numbers, and what, as a professional pollster, what jumped out at you?
Well, yeah, the numbers were pretty significant and pretty stunning, actually. First and foremost, when we asked just, do you think generally families in New Hampshire are kind of thriving, getting by, or struggling, we've actually got a significant majority of the state, about 58% of the state, that says most families are really struggling right now. So that's kind of point number one here in terms of...
Let me interrupt. How does that compare to the rest of the country? Are we more or less concerned here?
Slightly more. So we also did the same poll nationally, so we could compare numbers nationally. And nationally, that number is 52%. So New Hampshire is about 6 points higher than the national average here. But more directly, when it comes to childcare, they are incredibly concerned about affordability. As Rebecca mentioned, the high cost here, you actually have upwards of 75% saying that childcare in New Hampshire is expensive rather than affordable. Only 10% said it was affordable. And really what's stunning is when we asked if they thought it was expensive, you actually had almost half of the states classifying it as very expensive, right? So the cost is really meaningful and is really putting a real dent in our friends and neighbors here in New Hampshire's budgets. But on availability too, you've got about a third of the state that says it's really hard to find. So not only is it hard to find, but when you finally find it, you're actually paying a good deal of your paycheck for it.
So when you look at numbers about the things that people are concerned about, and I know you didn't poll this head to head, but you've got inflation is a common topic, and obviously childcare is a cost, so it would kind of fit in there, but inflation is a big thing. You've got housing costs, you got healthcare costs, and childcare costs. Can you give us your sense of where that ranks as far as an area of concern for families? Do you have any sense looking at numbers nationwide and here in New Hampshire?
Yeah. I mean, really right up there at the top. We actually, in my polls, as we'll get to when we poll about government doing something to help, it polls very well. It polls very strongly. We're talking upwards of 80% people supporting the government doing more here. But all that is preamble to say that when I get numbers that high, I get suspicious. And I say, okay, how resilient is this? And so in my polls, we actually make a conscientious effort to remind people about big issues like the economy and inflation, say, hey, is this still important? And so we actually directly asked, we said, hey, compared to other issues like the economy, like healthcare, right? How important is early childhood care? And we still get half of New Hampshire voters saying it is one of the most important issues out there. Now, I do think that probably on a lot of national polls, when you ask people open-ended questions, what's your biggest issue? You're going to get people saying economy and cost of living, which I think obscures just how much of an impact care for young children is having on their own economy and on their own cost of living.
And yeah, so you've got to pull those numbers out, but they're still in there. And so it's easy to see this isn't just a concern like a generic, I wish things were better, but it's rather a holy moly, it's right up front concern, along with how can I afford groceries, how can I afford my rent, et cetera. I want to ask you, Rebecca Woitkowski, whose name I'm repeating just because I practiced it so many times before this. So I want to say Woitkowski as many times as I can to get credit for having practiced it. No, but seriously, the work at New Futures, why is this a focus of your work at New Futures?
Sure. So New Futures is a nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy organization that looks at the health and wellness of New Hampshire residents. And I've had the joy to work in this early childhood field. And we know that investment in the early years saves the state money in the long run. It also ensures that we have a healthy, able-bodied workforce that can create a strong economic center for our state. So this has been a priority for the past 9 years in my work. And again, we're reaching the point where we just have so much data. I wanted to jump in and tell you that, when we think about the economic impacts, we have recent data that shows that for every unavailable childcare slot in New Hampshire, it costs Granite State families and businesses as much as $35,000. So really the lack of childcare means that families cannot go back to work at the capacity they want to, and that results in less economic growth for our state.
But there are people who would argue, and I'd like to hear from both of you on this, particularly in the State House in Concord, that it's great. We want to promote families, et cetera. But if you decide to have children, it's your job as parents to work this out, and that there should be a limited public aspect to finding funding, ensuring accessibility to childcare. What's first of all with you, Rebecca? What's your response to that? And then, Alex, what do the data say about how voters or citizens feel about that?
Well, I'll first say that no matter what, the lack of investment is going to cost the New Hampshire government down the line. So whether that comes and arises in additional school costs and K through 12 or other health costs later on that we bear through our healthcare system and other systems, we're going to pay a cost. And there's so much great data that there's huge return on investment for every dollar that we invest in the early care and education system in New Hampshire. So you really have to combat that myth. It isn't that it is just state government's responsibility. It is really our community's responsibility to come together with business leaders, lawmakers, and families to come up with creative solutions that are efficient, they're fiscally centered, and they really ensure that growth that we need to see in our state to overcome the issues that we have with our aging population. I'm going to ensure a bright future.
Alex?
Yeah, the data is very interesting in that, when asked if the state should be doing more to invest in early childhood care, as I said, you get 80% of people agreeing with that, supporting that statement, which means you have 70% of Republicans agreeing with that statement. And a lot of what we see when we ask about the programs and about the way the benefits they have, you can see that what really resonates with a more conservative leaning, more libertarian leaning state like New Hampshire is this idea of both social and economic returns, that this is actually one of the most efficient investments that government can make in terms of its future, right? That down the road, there are these massive network effects that in that you're spending less on social programs down the road. You have better families most immediately, which lead to better communities, which lead ultimately to less government spending on a lot of the things that take up a lot of the budget, right? And so this is a wise investment, and it's the right thing to do. I think that you see a lot of discussion also from the right of center that is really concerned about things like declining birth rates, the fertility rate. And as Rebecca brought up right at the beginning, and we're seeing in the data, these high costs are having real consequences in terms of direct family planning. We asked, have you delayed having children, or have you had fewer children, or are you planning to delay or planning to have fewer children? And we found that about 20% of New Hampshire voters fit in at least one of those categories. And that's incredibly consequential. So if people who are a little concerned about the government here being too involved, I think that one, it gets us the outcomes that we're interested in from a more conservative right of center perspective. But two, it's also a fiscally sound way to go about doing this. And there are conservative ways to do this, which is not one size fits all programs. And a perfect example of this is we actually tested about the New Hampshire scholarships program for childcare vouchers, and that has 84% across the state. And what it does is it gives parents options. This isn't the government coming in and telling you how to raise your kid. This is giving parents more options and helping them with the difficulty that they've encountered on this really important policy issue.
Could either of you kind of talk a little bit more about what you mean by I mean, are we talking essentially education freedom accounts for preschool? Is that how this would work?
So the childcare scholarship program is a little bit different. So it is available to working New Hampshire parents, and it doesn't provide a full dollar for dollar supplement for your childcare costs, but provides a discount to those costs. It can be used in a number of different settings, including those at-home or neighborhood settings to church childcare centers, and it supports childcare access from birth through age 13. So, as Alex said, it's really rooted in parent choice, and it's really connected to the fact that this is to support working families who do not have the wages to actually afford childcare on their own. And there are really great studies around the uptick and economic driver that the childcare scholarship program is in New Hampshire.
What's fascinating to me as someone who's covered politics in the United States for a long time now is that there was a time not that long ago where if you'd said to New Hampshire Republicans, we want you to support government subsidies for childcare, it would have been immediately, forget it, no way. If someone's dramatically poor, sure, if they're in, if they're that end of the economy, but otherwise forget it because it's just the wrong thing to do. And there's been this real shift. And Alex, I'm assuming you've seen it in your data since Donald Trump came down the golden escalator in 2015, where you have people who represent what might be called the J.D. Vance, Senator Josh Hawley side of the Republican Party are saying, look, we don't want the government to do a lot of things, but the one thing we want it to do is to be active in helping families. That's why they've supported increasing the earned income tax credit for parents with children. They support the increasing the deduction for children on your taxes, et cetera, that they have and some people might call it populist, some people might call it whatever, the new rights or the new. There's so many new rights. I don't know which iteration this is. But are you seeing in your data there are more and more people who would consider themselves Republican or conservative or whatever who are absolutely open to these ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. Taking off just kind of my good government and policy hat and putting on my political hat, because I've been working for Republican candidates and campaigns for over 20 years. What's interesting about this issue, this is what we call a blue ocean issue, in that there's not a lot of sharks bloodying the water over here on this issue. And it's not particularly partisan. Right? 80% approval, you actually have Republicans, independents, Democrats all supporting this. And so, if I were being very crassly political about this, there's a real first mover advantage to whichever party really owns this stuff. And so seeing Republicans kind of come out and be more in favor of doing things to support the family in a small government, small c conservative way, there's some real, I think dividends to be had. And that's not to say that they should make this an overtly partisan issue. I think it's bipartisanship is actually a real feature here, and it's something that in such a contentious time politically, I think a lot of voters are actually really kind of get excited about the idea that here's a problem. Here's a real crisis that we are all facing, our friends, our neighbors, loved ones, and we can do something about that. And so they can really get behind this quite easily.
So, Rebecca, we have a editorial stance at NHJournal.com that is, when it comes to communities, it's the Shawshank Redemption theory. You either get busy living or get busy dying. In other words, every town is either growing, and that means it's going to thrive, it's going to have a growing economic base, or it's dying. They've tried to limit growth. Usually they're talking about housing construction, but there are other things too. They think they've got exactly the right size town. And there's no such thing. Your town is either getting bigger or it's getting smaller. That's where it is. And so I'm just wondering if that, as people see what's happening with the labor force and the difficulty attracting workers, are people in New Hampshire more open to the idea that the days of NIMBY need to be moved past? We need to encourage families, encourage family growth, and encourage housing for those families to live in.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. And we have a lot of families and young families that want to put roots down in New Hampshire and grow, and they aren't sure yet if there's going to be that opportunity for them. And our communities are asking for solutions. And that is shown through the legislation that is being proposed, the conversations about, how do you reduce barriers to the individual who wants to open childcare center while ensuring child health? And I'll just underscore Alex's point. This is a bipartisan, nonpartisan issue. Everybody cares about their families, and children are center. It's not partisan. And that is really encouraging when we think about what the opportunities for our state may be in the future.
Yeah, it really is interesting how the issue of families and government involved with families have changed, and it is the base for support has grown across the partisan aisle, no doubt about it. I wonder though, there's an argument that goes like this: countries in Europe have tried to address their collapsing birth rates by doing things like encouraging more childcare, making childcare free, paying parents to have kids. Wow, if only someone had told me that back in the day. And yet the results have been not great at best, and in some cases just haven't worked at all. Do you think it's possible, Rebecca, for public policy to affect people's behavior? And I want to hear your thoughts on this as well, Alex.
I think so too. I think we also create our own culture and aspirational mindset. So if we can really do it the New Hampshire way and think about, what makes us such a great state and how we want to support, our families and really be first in the nation for supporting families, then we can do that. And there are examples of different policies that have worked. How we piece that together under an idea of, New Hampshire individualism is really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Rebecca said, which is really the conservative notion that is not one size fits all. There's not one federal solution here, right? There is the New Hampshire way, there is the Alabama way, and so on. And I think that's why you have, senators and governors, kind of across the country coming up with this as a way to help with these solutions. You have Katie Britt in Alabama talking about childcare. You have Deb Fisher in Nebraska talking about, Governor Kim Reynolds in Iowa are really coming out aggressively and talking about how, look, this is, yes, it helps families, but this is also a workforce issue. This is something that keeps people in the workforce. It keeps our town growing and thriving. Michael, to your point, I think that, a lot of communities in New Hampshire are very concerned about being able to keep growing and bringing people to their towns. And this is a good way to address that.
It's just fascinating to me the number of towns that are trying to not let people in and not build out. And I'm like, guys, you can't. This isn't Mayberry. They're not going to control the population with just Andy and Aunt B. I mean, you're gonna, either your town's going to thrive and it's going to be a place that draws people, and then that throws off dynamic economic activity, and then more people have more kids, and et cetera, or your town's going to be fading away. You're going to be one of these towns we hear about where they're having to close schools because the school age population has just gone away, and so you've got to make a choice. We got to wrap up. So I want to give you each a chance to kind of wrap things up. And I want to start with you, Alex, and go to Rebecca. Starting on the data side, Alex, what would you tell people who are still reluctant about the idea of these scholarships and of more government engagement? Like I said, from the political data, polling side. And then Rebecca, what would you say if we were sitting with a bunch of lawmakers and they were asking you about this? What would be kind of your main pitch to them? Alex, you first.
Well, I think the thing we found in our poll is that first and foremost, this is not an issue where you need to convince people of the problem. They are seeing it. They are experiencing it themselves. So that's a great starting point when it comes to this issue. But I think most importantly is when we talk about this as a bipartisan issue that can help with social and economic return on investments, this is an efficient way to really deal with a lot of the issues that our New Hampshire families are experiencing. That can really bring people around on this.
Yeah, and I would just add in that our lawmakers have an opportunity to be leaders in this space, and they're backed by public opinion and data. So we also do not have a preconceived early care and education system in New Hampshire. So we have the opportunity to build that, which is reflective of our state's values and the idea that we really want to support parent choice. And that choice may change, from the moment you bring home an infant until that child goes into a K through 12 system. And so really, we want to work in partnership. There's this opportunity, and, this is the best thing for our state.
Rebecca Woitkowski, that is a great point about the fact that we don't have an entrenched bureaucratic system or an entrenched pre-existing notion that you have to fight against. We can start this and see where it goes and experiment and develop and get smarter. That's a great point. Plus, you gave me the chance to say Woitkowski again, so I really appreciate that. Hey, I had to practice. I want to make sure I get it all in. And also Alex, what's his name? Alex Lundry, of course. Thank you both so much for helping bring us up to speed on childcare, accessibility, and its challenges here at New Hampshire Journal. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This edition of Up to Speed is brought to you by Centerline Liberties. Centerline Liberties is a 501c3 focused on advancing policy solutions capable of defending core constitutional freedoms and liberties, preserving a free market economy, and limiting the role of government in Americans' everyday lives. Find them at centerlineliberties.org.